Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do: to educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons, and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. What's going on, everybody? Welcome to today's show. I have an exciting show today. This is the first time he and I are meeting. This is Rob Docters, and he has a recent book out called Ethics and Hidden Greed. And this is something that is the Next Level Human family. All of you who listen to this podcast, you know we talk an awful lot about what it means to be a good human. And Rob Docters is somebody who was brought to my attention, and I'm just like, wow, okay, here's a guy who we were just talking off the air, and Rob was telling me, you know what, he's retired now, but he's not sitting still. He has a goal to make the world a better place. And this is why he wrote this book. He does have a pretty impressive pedigree, so I'll just brag on him here in just a minute. He started his education at Stanford, then he went to law school at William and Mary. And then where was it? Where'd you go next?
Columbia for MBA.
Yeah, Columbia for MBA. And then I spent a little stint at Yale as well, correct?
Taught at Yale for a couple of years.
And so, you know, Rob has been around. This is the, you know, sort of his life's work. This is an expert that we can really sort of, just ask him what the issues are. And so, Rob, you know, I'm really excited you're here. I always like to say this because the Next Level Human way of doing things, it's like people, we have our education, right? We have the things we learn in our lives, and we have our paths in our lives. And some of us choose to create things that will make the world better. And you putting out this book, I'm just in gratitude for you for sharing this work, and in very much in gratitude for you for showing up here. So let me kind of start this discussion and just throw this out at you just right off the bat. You know, you obviously wrote this book because you felt something was wrong in the world. That's how most of us do it. You wanted to create something to correct this problem. So why don't we start there, just in your words, where you were just like, you know what, I have got to put this work out because something is wrong in the world. And I want to kind of hear what your whole thought process was around bringing this life to work.
Sure. A lot of things came together, but in a way it started at a breakfast. I was having a breakfast with a client. She CEO of a multi-$100 million company, and she's really smart. And she made an interesting comment during breakfast. She said, you know, I feel like I've been a victim of some things, but I'm not really sure when and where and how. So afterwards I thought, wow, you know, we have a really bright woman, and she can't put her finger exactly on where and when it happened. So that prompted some thinking. And in the end, I concluded that greed, like many things in life, is evolving. Greed is smarter than it was 50 years ago. Greed has managed to think of ways of obtaining what it wants, but it's not immediately obvious to the victims. So that's what prompted the hidden greed part of the title. The ethics part was interesting because I think a lot of people have no clue what ethics are. And I don't say it in an insulting way. It's just that's not something that's taught very broadly, either in primary school or college or anywhere else. So I rummaged around a bit, and I found a professor from Cambridge University in England who had written a book in 1669.
Wow, that's a long time.
Yeah, not a recent book,
Yeah.
but it was extremely straightforward. And it said, this is ethical. This is ethical. That's not ethical. And, you mentioned we live in a politicized world. Well, one of the nice things about 1669 is you can't associate that person with any party that you care to dislike. So,
yeah. And who was this author?
His name is Professor Henry Moore, More. And he was an interesting person just by himself. He was exactly what you picture of as a very dug into the work kind of academic. He was offered to be president of his college, and he turned it down. And he turned down all sorts of other honors. He just wanted to write and learn and teach. And, good for him.
Yeah, it's funny about that when you talk about, the time period. To me, I'm a reader of philosophy. Some of my favorite philosophers, Immanuel Kant, which is, one that's one of my favorites, who does a lot in sort of with ethics. And to me, these Enlightenment thinkers, what's different about them is they were at a time where they could sit around, think all day. They were also at a time where the world was very tumultuous. They were, watching this crazy world. And so I didn't know that this is where some of your inspiration came from, but I certainly take a lot of my inspiration from this time period as well, because I think it's a unique time period in terms of people thinking about very difficult things, not being distracted by, internet and TV and things like that. And, the world was a pretty volatile and, very different, with a lot of, people trying to figure out what is right, what is wrong, revolutions, all these kinds of things that, that were going on from the 1500s all the way, to the early 1900s. It's really interesting that this is where it started. I'm curious because, I feel like as much reading as I've done, I also am ignorant to ethics. And so can we just start with like a brief sort of understanding of, what really are the basics of ethics for those of us who have not necessarily made this our lives work? What do we need to be thinking about to be ethical people, or to judge others as ethical or unethical?
Okay. The answer is in general, the definition Professor Moore gives ethics is that which would make you and other people happier, what lets them live a happy life. Now, Charles Manson may have led a happy life doing some unethical things, but in general, that's the idea. And
well, he certainly wasn't making other people happy. He might have been happy, but he wasn't making other people happy. So am I right in saying that something ethical, it makes you happy, but also impacts other people in a positive way?
Absolutely. And in fact, the Professor Moore describes 23 rules. We can go through them, but I doubt you want to. That represent kind of a manual for ethical living. And they range the whole course of things, but they're very, very profound. For instance, just by way of example, one of them is, not only should you not lie, you should not create something that creates untruths or lies. And I read that, and suddenly artificial intelligence popped into my mind. This is someone creating a device that is pretty indifferent to what it says is true or not. It just basically takes the existing data, layers on the different algorithms, which is how AI works, and doesn't really care whether it's ethical, positive, or anything. That's what it claims it's going to give as an output. So, at any rate, Moore went through a lot of stuff, and I thought he clever things. And regarding that last piece, he said to release a lie into the world that other people believe is like releasing a ghost. It will set you on a path that you don't know the answer to and will create unhappiness. So,
Yeah.
By the way, a chunk of his book, because it's not in every library, is an appendix in the back of my book, because I felt people should be able to read this when they want to.
Yeah.
The other thing that's worth mentioning is a lot of people confuse ethics with morality and ethics with law, and they're different. And Professor Moore, again, describes how different they are. Example, to park in the wrong parking spot. That's not unethical. It's not immoral. It's nothing. It's illegal. You'll get a ticket, but it's not any of those other two things. So law is its own thing. Morality is whether something is consistent with a precept, either a religious precept or a personal precept of how you should live your life. And a good example of morality is do unto others as you would have them do to you. And again, that's not strictly ethics, although that's a good overlap example. Ethics, on the other hand, the example that one ethicist wrote was, he said, if you tell your children that they have to eat their meal and afterwards they're entitled to a dessert, and you change that rule, and at the end you say, well, you may have eaten your meal, you're not getting your dessert, that's unethical. And it's not illegal and it's not immoral, but it is unethical. Another example of moral, by the way, is if you're walking along a river and your wife or someone you owe a duty to falls into the river, there's no legal obligation for you to jump in after her, but there is an ethical one. A moral one. And that's just worth knowing, because otherwise, if you don't know the rule, you're not going to behave that way.
Yeah. So based on that, if I'm understanding this correctly, do you see these in a hierarchy, or are they just sort of all three separate things? Would you say that one is better than the other? Like, is it better to be moral? Is it better to be ethical, or is it better to, stay within the law? Because from my perspective, I would say, just listening to this, I would say, ethics sounds a little bit more like integrity. Morality sounds a lot like, what culture, thinks you should do and the agreements around that. And law seems like it's more coded things to keep people in order. But I don't know if that's how you would break that down.
There is a hierarchy to these. For instance, interestingly enough, in law school, I learned the reason for a jury is to act as a limit to what a court can do. The original juries were created because at the same time that the French had rolled over into England and the Norman conquest and had taken over England, the juries were there to make sure that the French lords did not do something that was unfair to the peasants. So in that case, clearly, that stage of history, that country had placed law below morality. Your next question might be, all right, so where is ethics? The answer is not so clear. In fact, I've never been asked that question before. Good question.
Yeah, I'm part of me, and I don't know, maybe we can flush it out here as we speak, but part of me feels like when I was hearing your definitions that ethics seems like more of a personal thing, whereas morality seems like something judged against culture, and laws obviously are, but I don't know. It's just really interesting, and I know ethics and morality seem so close. Doesn't seem like they're easy to sort of tease apart. But I love going through this because this begins mining your discussion with all the listeners of the philosophy really around this. And ultimately, if we're trying to be good people, essentially you're telling us, all right, you want to be aware of this difference between, morality, ethics, and the law. And so you wrote this book because you were obviously concerned about some of the things that are going on in the world, in the corporate space, in the political space, and also, just from my perspective, and you and I were kind of talking offline, so I'll just include the listeners into this. From my perspective, I look at the political landscape and the corporate landscape, and then I look at the individuals who are incredibly suspect now, believing anything. So what are we meant to believe, about vaccines? What are we meant to believe about what our politicians say and whether that's true or not? How trustworthy are people like the FDA and the CDC? And it sounds like this is ultimately why you're sort of approaching this work. And to me, these are, really important questions now, because we come from a place where it seemed like we used to trust, and now we simply don't. And I'm assuming this is part of, what you're tackling in this work.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's good. You've raised the basic question, which is who is ethical, and the answer is, let's take it from the other side. Who's unethical? And there's a couple of rules that are actually work pretty well as to figuring out who's unethical. People are unethical because they feel entitled to be. That's a really important statement. So when you look at someone, ask, what does he expect or she expect the world to provide her? There's a wonderful case study. The book, by the way, to answer that question, delves just a little bit into psychology. And there's a guy who had a great experiment, which was he set up what he claimed were focus groups, and he had a group of participants who were wealthy show up, and he put them in a waiting room with a giant bowl of candy. And he said, the bowl of candy's there. You can have one candy, but the bowl is really for a bunch of children who are here tomorrow, and we want to have enough candy for them. So only take one. He did the same thing with a group of not wealthy people. And he said, but you can only have one. So you already guessed it. The wealthy people dug right in, and they all had multiple candies. The not wealthy people just took one. That's because the wealthy people felt entitled.
And so entitlement's a big deal here then.
Exactly. And you have some really famous cases like Martha Stewart, who, as you know, ended up in jail, so crossing the law as well as ethics. But I thought it was very interesting. She did her illegal deeds shortly after having gone public with her company, and she was worth $1.9 billion. But then when her stockbroker came to her and said, hey, we might make $200,000 if you do this illegal thing with your stocks, she said, sure. She didn't need $200 million. I mean, you and I would notice it, but she didn't. So she went ahead with it, and she did the illegal thing. And in the end, she paid for it, but she didn't need it. But she expected it. She had spent her whole life seizing opportunities, and this was one of them.
I'm sorry to break into the show, but I wanted to take a second to cover one of our sponsors and tell you all about Paleo Valley at paleovalley.com. These are the grass-fed sticks that I tell you all so much about, that all of my friends know I have on hand constantly. They are in my car. They are at my house. I keep them at my sister's home and my parents' house. I have these things everywhere because they are the simplest, most convenient whole foods protein supplement you can get. Almost like carrying around pure protein, low carb protein in your pocket. They also, these Paleo Valley beef sticks, are the only 100% grass-fed and grass-finished beef sticks on the market. They use organic spices. They are naturally fermented instead of using nitrates and nitrites that can be a problem in some of these cured meats. And they simply taste fantastic. Check out the original or the jalapeno. Those are my favorites. Please make sure you go over to paleovalley.com and visit. When checking out, use the code NEXTLEVEL for a 15% discount. Remember, Our sponsors keep the show going by you giving them your patronage and spending your money on these high quality products. You actually do a few things. One, you're helping to support the podcast. And two, you are helping your health. And three, you are making sure that good quality companies like Paleo Valley can be out there doing their business, changing the world, making the earth better. One of the things you may not know about this is that grass-fed organic and grass-finished beef is doing something that is so utterly important for our environment, actually helping to repopulate the topsoil. A lot of people don't know this, but our topsoil is being extremely depleted. And raising animals, especially cattle, the correct way helps to get that topsoil back. This is one of the reasons why I love Paleo Valley. Not to mention it tastes fantastic, but they're one of these companies, like my other sponsors, Cured Nutrition and Organifi, that are doing the right things by the environment. I really appreciate everything they do, and I hope you will check them out. Thanks so much. PaleoValley.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. And now back to the show. Yeah, that's a really interesting case, right? So it's almost like, well, she feels entitled to make more, or maybe she feels entitled to be able to have insider information, and that is just, because of her position, and she takes advantage of it, which in a sense can make us have some level of empathy for that. And on the other side can have some level of contempt for that. Because I can understand, I can go on one hand, I could say, wow, I guess I can sort of understand where someone's coming from in that situation if they're not thinking and they're kind of out of touch in a sense. So on the one hand, I can slightly understand that, some empathy, but then also some contempt for the idea that, oh, you think the rules don't apply to you. And that is an interesting sort of way of looking at it. And maybe this is why these things divide a lot of people, because maybe some people who, sort of go, could be in a position where they go, no, I don't think there's anything really wrong with that. And someone else might be like, what are you talking about? That's unfair. And seems to be some of the arguments we get in when we get into politics and things like that. I'm curious what you're seeing in the conversations that you're having. You mentioned to me that you basically were a consultant for a long time. You worked in law for a long time. And you mentioned this idea of greed evolving. What have you seen that is different now in this ethical landscape with companies and individuals versus, government entities? Like, for some people, for example, I guess if you're a liberal, you're kind of like, well, I'm going to trust the FDA and the CDC, but I'm certainly not going to trust, the tobacco companies and the pharmaceutical companies. And it seems like the Republicans are oftentimes on the other side. I'm not going to trust the government. They're the problem, but I'll trust corporations. We know that there's probably ethical issues in both places. And I'm wondering, are there some commonalities here? Like, are the same ethics challenges showing up in government, in corporation, and in individuals? And do you see any, signs or symptoms that are pointing to general themes that we're having to deal with, in the current culture?
Well, there are a number of themes, but to squarely address what you just said, you see unethical behaviors both on the parts of government and on the part of corporations. They tend to be a little different, and maybe the scale is different sometimes, but nonetheless, examples. One of the examples, and actually, let me give you one that blends the two. You walk into a pharmacy and you'll see this little rack of what you would call suntan lotion. Well, it is, but some of them actually say suntan lotion or sunscreen. Others do not. What's the difference between those two? And the answer is nothing. What happened was that the original suntan lotion people went out. They patented 5 ingredients for suntan lotion. And they went to the FDA and said, hey, these are the 5 ingredients, that are important in the suntan lotion. So if anybody else calls what they've got suntan lotion, but it's not those 5 ingredients, you should stop them. So if you start a suntan lotion company and you don't have those 5 ingredients, which by the way happen to be patented, you will get the knock on the door from the FDA, encouraged by some of the incumbents. Now, you might say, well, maybe that's just the way it is. But no, it's not. In Europe, there's 22 ingredients that have been improved for suntan lotions. The only difference is if you get to use that label, you can charge a higher price. Suntan lotion. So, hey, they are now blocking their competitors. And if you don't happen to know the facts I just gave you, you might think, well, I better take the more expensive one because it's got, the FDA approval for this. And the answer is,
yeah, that's so interesting. So unethical on both sides.
yes.
Unethical in the sense of corporations, and unethical in the way the government, I don't know the right language here. Some might say colluded or agreed with. But I think for someone like me who's doesn't consider themselves on the left or the right, I tend to see the world just like you described. Like from my perspective, when people go, "Oh, it's the government," I go, "And the corporations." And when people go, "It's the corporations," I go, "And the government."
Yes.
And then I oftentimes wonder to myself, what happens when you have these large sort of organizations? Because there's two arguments to be made here, right? Like if I'm sitting here talking to you, Rob, or it's me and you and a few of the listeners, we can look across the table at each other. We can kind of get to know each other. If one of us lies, it's going to be likely perhaps that, if you have a group of people, if it's just me and you, maybe you and I can go, hey, we're going to keep this a secret, right? But it seems to me that the more people we bring into our group, the less likely it becomes, statistically speaking, for someone to go, I'm going to keep this secret along with Jade and Rob, let's say. If it's, like maybe if I'm a single person, I definitely can keep it and be unethical. You come in, it's, we can do a pretty good job, but it's less likely if it's just one person. And the larger it gets, it seems like it's more likely not to be able to be kept a secret. And I guess what I'm asking here then is, like, to me, I go, when I'm worried about ethics and things like that, is there any truth to the fact that the bigger the organization gets, you become more unethical or more ethical, right? Because conspiracy theories, in a sense, are really interesting things. Like, to me, the larger amount of people it would take to, conspire means that the more likely it is to get out. If it's just me and you and we, we decided we're going to do something highly illegal, we could probably keep that secret. So I'm wondering, why does it seem to many people, and is it true that larger organizations tend to be more unethical, or, or not? I'm wondering if you have any ideas here, because some people might just say, well, they're unethical because people are unethical. Other people might say they're unethical because there's something unique about these organizations that make them unethical. And I'm wondering if you have any, sort of insight on that. And I'll give you one example where my mind is, just to my mind is like the idea of, let's say, you're a lobbyist and, you're for a company, and you and I can't go to Congress and just be like, hey, I want this law passed. We can't just walk in and see, a senator or whatever without some gatekeepers, but these lobbyists certainly can. And maybe, the organizations are simply set up in a way that makes unethical behavior more likely. I don't know. I'm curious if this is something you've thought about, if it's something you tackle in the book, because obviously nowadays, the world is rife with conspiracy theories. And I think we would all agree that there's a lot of unethical stuff going on, but we can't always tell. And the larger the organizations get, sometimes it seems like the more difficult to tell the truth.
Well, what I learned from looking into this is I was surprised. I thought, evil person does an evil deed, fine, understood. But what it turns out is evil and conspiracies and unethical behaviors often are conspiracies. They often require teamwork. You may, a recent, very public example, but there are thousands of them, was Jeff Epstein. And he didn't sexually abuse all these young women by himself. He had dozens of allies. He had very powerful people. He had a federal prosecutor who handed him the lightest possible deal they could ever hit, and then sent him out in the street again for zero bail. Now, eventually this caught up with him. But the point was, it wasn't him. It's a whole conspiracy of people. So the answer is you have to watch for those conspiracies, because if you're a single victim, you will have a hard time fighting against that. And unethical people target the weak. Many people, are weak. The poor are weak. Over history, women have been weak. The people who don't happen to have an army have been weak.
Yeah, and by weak you mean not in positions of power, not in dominant positions of power due to the cultural, sort of construct.
Exactly. Yeah. So giving, and it's just too bad, but we probably don't teach the weak how to defend themselves. I mean, recently with the Me Too movement, women have found out there's some ways they can at least publicize, if not actually, counteract being sexually exploited. But, it's always been, they've been on the receiving side of that. What's interesting is that sometimes there's battles back and forth between the ethical and the unethical. And it's like any war, it's not clear who's going to win. I was really interested to see, apparently a few years ago, the White House, which you'd assume was a fairly powerful organization, had its computers hacked. They think that some Russians were behind it, but they don't actually know. So they went, our security people went in and they canceled the programs that were the hacking programs and purged them from the computer. And much to their surprise, immediately there was a new program replacing the old one. The hackers had become very sophisticated at replacing the programs immediately. And according to the head of cybersecurity for the White House, it wasn't clear who would win for a little while. So this whole notion that greed almost has a personality, it fights back, it looks for weakness, it is ruthless, is something that hadn't occurred to me for a long time. But researching the book, yes, it is. Now, there's still individual examples of unethical behavior. For instance, looking back again a few hundred years, it was interesting. There was a case in England of a baker. And in those days, you didn't buy bread by the loaf. You bought it by how much it weighed. So the baker would take a lump of bread, stick it on a scale, and say, it's 2 pounds. That'll be X many, shillings that'll cost. And that was the basis for the agreement. What happened, though, was in those days, labor was cheap, ingredients were expensive. There was a boy beneath the counter and a little trap door. So the little trap door would open. The boy would reach up, grab a lump of dough, pull it down, close the trap door, and then the baker would take the bread, put it in the oven. And apparently bread always loses weight in the oven because of moisture evaporates. Anyway, he did that for quite a while. It improved his profitability for quite a while. And then he got caught. And then bad things started happening to the baker. He was drawn and quartered. He was hung. He died. Now, you might say, well, that was then. This is now. But you may notice that, of course, Apple got fined over $60 million because they did exactly the same thing. If you had an older iPhone, they would slow down your iPhone.
Yes, I remember this.
And then you'd have to go and buy, but are not cheap, a new iPhone. So, sometimes these are sort of solo players. Sometimes they're corporations acting in concert. I don't know how many people inside Apple knew this was happening, but in any event, that's how greed can operate.
Yeah, and let me give you some personal experience here from my company. And I said I wanted to talk about this briefly because so my company is seen by, I think could be seen by many people, and I think is seen by, in general. We can go out and look at our reviews, and we try to pay very close attention to that. But the company, it's actually not my company, but the company my programs are affiliated with. I'm the face of this. This would be companies like Natural Health Sherpa that are publishers for my works. And as I've gotten closer with them, part of what we do is we sell workout programs, right? And then we do upsells on things like supplements and things like this. Now, part of what happens with that tech as you go through, so I'll walk you through this, and I want you to tell me what you think about this ethically, because I do have some issues, and me and my business partners talk about this often, like how can we do this better? But the way the process works when you buy is you see me in a video. I'm talking to you. So Rob would be watching, or you, the listeners, would be watching. I'm talking to you. This video is going on. There's no real way to skip ahead in this video, which bothers me a little bit. But anyway, so it says, hey, buy this program. Here's why. And it's very educational. So what we're trying to do is we call it educational sales. So we're teaching you something. So if you don't buy, then the thought process behind it is, well, we've taught you something, and we leave a good taste in your mouth, and you will, essentially take this information and perhaps, do it on your own. But anyway, you buy. And then once you buy, then I'll pop up again and say, hey, by the way, you might need some protein powder. And I explain to you about protein powder. And then after you buy that, I say, hey, by the way, you might need this supplement. And I explain to you about this supplement. Now, part of the issue here is oftentimes what we do is we say, hey, by the way, you can save money if you get 3 tubs of protein powder rather than just 1, or you could save some money. And from our perspective as the business owners, we see this as win-win, okay? Because we see it as like, you're getting a discount on this. We're actually teaching you something along the way. If you bought these, and we know just from, my, sort of professional background, that these things are highly effective. However, so that's the side of, for us, where we think we're ethical. But on the other side in the business, we can see where some things could be perhaps unethical, where we leave these people in these long videos, perhaps, and that this is trapping them there. And sometimes because of the way the tech works, if they buy the program and then they exit out, right, they still can get charged. And so we get a lot of customer support stuff coming back where we have to issue refunds. But what's really interesting, and the reason I bring this up, is because throughout my career, I'm someone who, obviously, I'm passionate about this work, and I'm passionate about being ethical and moral. And I've had my own struggles, as people have known, and with this podcast, like, I had an affair, back in the day. And like, I've come to terms with honesty is the most important thing to me. In fact, I say honesty is kinder than kindness. But I bring this up, and I want to talk to the expert about this, because to me, as much as you try to pay attention to this stuff, this is not stuff we're doing on purpose. In fact, most of this stuff is done thoughtfully, thinking we're benefiting the client. And then when they go through the process, oftentimes they have, maybe an ethical concern or voice an ethical concern. And we take these things very seriously and have made adjustments as a result of some of this feedback. But I still think some people could see something like that type of business process and say it's unethical, or, you're a scam, or especially when, it's in the health and fitness industry, which we know is not an industry that's very highly looked upon. It's sort of the current industry. It's seen almost as used car salesman type stuff. But I'm wondering if you have any feedback on this kind of thing, where there's this kind of gray zone. How does a company, for example, if you're someone who's running a company and wants to be as ethical as possible, but thinks they're doing a good thing, or also wants to make sure they're profitable so that they can continue to deliver their service, because as a business, you're not going to be able to do that if you can't be profitable. Are there rules, and does your book cover rules, sort of around this? Like, what are the things that I should be looking at? Is there any red flag that you saw pop up in sort of my discussion with this? Does this more get into like, ethics versus morality versus legality kind of stuff again? But I'm just curious how you see this. What can people like my company, Apple, other companies do to make sure that, yes, we're being profitable so we can continue to deliver a service which we believe the world needs, but at the same time be attentive to this incredibly important aspect of, wanting to be good humans and good companies who are doing good work?
Well, the general answer is that Professor Moore, back in 1669, wrote a book called Eccentra Ethicum. He wrote it in Latin while he was at it. And he gives you 23 rules on how to be ethical. And the big book actually begins with non sort of academic. It's a hit case story of the 5 different modern ways that people exhibit unethical greed. So the part that this bumps up against, and I'd love to listen to it before I make any comment, but is there's something called hooking. And what some companies do is they get you to invest in what they're doing. This could be an argument that they're invest some time, but usually it's money. So, for instance, a leading tax software company decided, everybody who does their taxes then wants what they've written down recorded, and the previous year's taxes, because you build upon those. So what they do is they sold at a great bargain some software that deals immediately with your taxes. And then afterwards, people discover, hey, it's missing my ability to look at what I did last year, the ability to look at last year's laws, et cetera, et cetera. But by that time, you've already bought and used that current day software. So you have to then buy into last year's software.
Yeah, this is TurboTax, right? It's TurboTax.
Yeah, that's not what I was thinking of, but yes, they do some of that. So the answer is hooking people is not ethical. Simple as that. So the question is, you can't always, in fact, you can never, I think, offer somebody something without them at least investing some listening to and understanding of what you're offering them. So that's why I'm hesitant to say that's unethical. I'm just observing that's a route that many unethical people take, and you need to know what you're doing. And if
that's super helpful, let's follow up on that a little bit, because from my perspective, I can see that 2 ways. One, I hate that, by the way, whenever I have that situation happen. Also, I can see knowing when I work with my accountant, that when I work with just a regular accountant, it's like, okay, are you going to just do my taxes at the end of the year? Are you going to actually manage my files? That's an extra charge. Are you going to actually do my QuickBooks for me? That's an extra charge, because obviously it gets more and more expensive the more time that is invested in this. So with this particular tax company, would it be more ethical than to say, here's all the services right up front and you go ahead and buy them? Because I also can see where it's like, all right, you just wanted your personal taxes done, and maybe give people options. Is it the options that makes it more ethical? So it's like, hey, just so you know, we'll do your taxes for this, but if you want the record of it, you're going to have to pay this, and if you want us to continue to hold this stuff in a file somewhere, it's going to be this. Is that really what it's about? Like, where it's ethical if you say, here's all the different prices up front, versus kind of sneakily adding this stuff on, knowing that people might run into issues? Because obviously I could see that makes sense logically, that the more services you need, the more the more expensive it's going to be. But yes, I can say for myself, I usually like to see what the expenses are going to be up front, rather than getting caught later and being like, oh, this is something I didn't know. So it sounds like what you're saying is the more upfront a company can be, and more transparent they can be in terms of the fees associated with their services, the better.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the sad truth is that the world is not simple. I mean, sometimes explaining all the options is going to take a while. Explaining all the options, is not even possible in many cases.
Yeah, that's the issue, right? I was thinking the same thing. I was like, I get why some companies may have to do this. I certainly can see why my company, does some of these things, because we will see very quickly where people don't take action on the first thing that they really need. And if we then throw all this stuff in, they don't realize that, well, it's only $30 to get a 12-week workout program. But if we throw all the stuff in on top, the other stuff they might need right off the bat, they're going to think it costs $300.
Yeah, and they may not even listen to your argument about why that additional $270 is worth it. They may not listen. So they go off to the next offer, and they're less candid than you are. So they'll get snookered, and frankly, you come out behind because you were honest. By the way, it's not just what people sort of say, it's what they do. One of my favorite examples, and as I say, I don't think it's unethical, but it is an interesting business example, is there's a travel ticket purchasing thing called Expedia. And what Expedia does is very clever, which is they ask you, all right, you want to go from New York to London or wherever, that'll be, $300. If and the person who now hears $300 drops off, they know why you're doing it. Either they've got a better offer somewhere else, or they're now going to look further for, a cheaper price. But what they do is they put a little cookie in your computer. And when you come back, they'll say, oh yeah, that was him again. And what they'll do is they will actually raise the price. So now it'll be $310 because they know you went out somewhere else. Somebody else is charging more than $300, $320, whatever. And this is actually just their response to, learning what the competition is doing.
I want to jump in real quick and tell you about one of my favorite new products. And to start out, I want to ask you a question. If you had to follow your friends around who are not the healthiest in the world and see what they are doing, what would be the number one thing you would probably tell them to do to start? For most people, that's going to be drinking more water, right? This is something that we talk about all the time in health and fitness. It's almost as if we think of it as an afterthought now because obviously water is so crucial. However, we oftentimes get this wrong. For example, did you know that when it comes to hydration, just drinking water can make things worse? Most people don't know this. Why? Partly because most people are over drinking water and under consuming the electrolytes that help water do its job. What we don't realize is that hydration is not just about water. It's about electrolytes, the minerals in there, as well as getting that water into the cells. And so you do not want to be over consuming water if you're not getting your electrolytes right. And this opens up a whole new discussion because most people are not getting their electrolytes right. For example, did you know that too low sodium is an issue? Just as much, if not more so, than high sodium. In other words, what we want if we're going to get the right electrolytes is to get the right amount of sodium and potassium and magnesium in the Goldilocks zone. We don't want too much. We don't want too little. We want it just right. This opens up a whole other thing here too, because people who are exercising, doing sauna therapies, doing low carb diets are disrupting and losing lots and lots of their electrolytes. For example, when insulin is not around in low carb diets, you will excrete lots of sodium. In other words, under that state, exercising, low carb diets, all these things, you actually need more sodium. And so if you're somebody who has been just drinking water, not paying attention to electrolytes, and also feeling fatigued, feeling like you're underperforming, not sleeping right, getting cramps, twitches, headaches, any of these things, then you are probably dealing with an electrolyte issue. This is where the product LMNT comes in. This product has been a game changer for me and many, many of my patients and clients. This is a rehydration electrolyte beverage, basically. It is a powder of electrolytes formulated with 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams magnesium without the added sugar and other nonsense that comes in beverages like Gatorade. This stuff is basically a rehydration beverage on steroids. It is the thing that is going to replenish your electrolytes in the right ratios, decrease fatigue, really correct chronic dehydration. And by the way, many people are dehydrating themselves, becoming hyponatremic, low sodium, when they're consuming too much water. You need your electrolytes on board, especially if you are someone who is losing lots of sodium and other electrolytes through low carb diets and lots of exercise. This is where LMNT comes in. LMNT is a new sponsor to the Next Level Human podcast. I cannot recommend this product enough. I have been using this stuff for months now, and I have immediately seen changes in my energy levels. I feel like I'm operating on a whole other level, and I have seen this as being the primary thing that people who have been using LMNT have been telling me, that their fatigue is getting better, especially fatigue that comes after very intense workouts that involve lots of sweating and lots of intense output from the nervous system. Please check out LMNT. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. DrinkLMNT.com. That's DrinkLMNT.com. DrinkLMNT.com, and let's get back to the show. Oh, that is so interesting, Rob. I mean, it's so interesting, right? And you're right. Like I can kind of like being a business person and dealing in tech I understand we have these conversations all of the time. And I usually am the one wanting to go all the way to, let's just be completely transparent. But it really is not as simple as that, because when you do sometimes confuse the issues. And so in my business part, with me and my business partners, we are constantly going back and forth having this discussion. And to your point, we do realize there are just going to be some people, no matter what we do, that are going to see us as unethical. And my whole thing is, I'm one of these people that goes, I want to always ask the question that perhaps we are, because I do think, and this is another question for you, I do think that sometimes unethical behavior isn't purposeful. Right? Like sometimes we get into these unethical sort of situations because we're simply not thinking it through. And because, to your point, it's complicated. And so for me, that scares me as a person and a business owner. And that's why one of the major reasons I was interested to talk to you and reading this book is because I go, this is a very complicated thing. And there are some people who are just going to, by the nature of, the psychology of money and other things, that if they spend any money, they feel ripped off by a company. But, most people I know, and this might surprise people who aren't business owners, most of my business owner friends, they're the least greedy people I know. They put so much entrepreneurial money, skin in the game, time, lifeblood, kind of like you and I are both authors. Like, let's face it. We're not making money off those books. We're doing it because we feel that, we are making some money, but it very rarely covers the cost of the time and all that. Yeah, exactly. And a lot of people don't know that because they think, oh, you wrote a book and you must have made millions of dollars. Most authors aren't making anything off that. They just believe in it. I can honestly say that most of the stuff that I've done in my life is simply because I believe that it's so important that I want it out there. And I am terrified that I am inadvertently doing unethical things. And this is, to me, something we all individually should be paying very, very close attention to. And I guess my final question or thought, and we can continue talking as long as you want, because I'm just fascinated by this and I'm so grateful for your expertise. But to me, Rob, I come to this place and I go, well, so what is it then? To me, it almost seems like the only true way that you can possibly be as ethical as possible is just to be within yourself, as honest within your integrity, have these rules. Like one of the rules I have comes from Kant, which essentially says, never manipulate someone else's reality, period. And in my businesses, I look at it through that lens. When we're doing these processes, are we manipulating their reality? Are we giving them everything they need to know? And then I just have to go, I've done the best I can. I know people are going to see me perhaps as unethical, and I continue to have to be diligent to make sure I'm not being unethical, because I'm sure I could find myself in a situation and be like, oh my gosh, like I didn't realize it, but perhaps we are manipulating their reality. And I'm wondering, where's your thought on this? Is this really just an individual thing? Is the solution that each individual has to come up with an honor code and has to, live an ethical life and educate themselves on this, and then the world will get better? Or are there really things that we can do organizationally wise? Like one of the things I already want to do is just get this list, this 23 list from your book, to essentially say, hey, we should go down a list like this to make sure that we are covering these things. But I'm wondering how you see the major solution for individuals and organizations.
Well, let me give you sort of a broader answer than your question. The truth is, ethics requires work. It doesn't happen naturally. And yes, companies need to work to be ethical, and they need to necessarily pay in blood sometimes. One of the really wonderful ethical examples was a few years ago when India, the government of India, was swinging a little bit to the left. And they approached two companies that worked in India, IBM and Union Carbide. And they said to each of them, hey, we want 51% ownership of IBM India and Union Carbide India. Because after all, we are our own company, we get to be self-determinating, etc. And the answers were different. IBM said, we appreciate that, but we're sorry. If it says IBM on the door, IBM has to own it. And they actually volunteered to just shut down IBM India. Union Carbide went, and what they did was they sold 51% of Union Carbide to the Indians. That may not sound horrible, but fast forward not a long time, the unions in India, who have strong support from the government, came in and they said, well, we don't want to do it this way, we want to do it that way, and did a whole bunch of stuff. The result was the disaster in Bhopal, because the unions were not into the same safety regulations as Union Carbide was.
And what was that disaster? What was the disaster that occurred?
Apparently, the union members did not want to take the same safety precautions. They did not do the same checks. They did not, frankly, work as hard at having a safe factory.
And was there a crash or an accident or something? I'm not familiar with the history of this.
Yeah, over 40 people were killed. Because they were all dangerous chemicals and they caught fire and they blew up, etc.
I see.
And the Indian government, of course, wasn't going to take any blame. So they blamed Union Carbide. But in fact, the reason that it all happened was because the government had wanted to control the factory.
That's such an interesting case study. And we have to learn from these.
Yes. So just to say it, there was pain on IBM's side, the willingness to shut down IBM India if needed. The lazy approach, which was Union Carbide, was unethical and very, very immoral and dangerous. So the point is, it does take work. Also, this is the big thing, it takes work on both sides of the table. So, for instance, there's an amusing old expression from Roman times, which was, if fools didn't go to market, cracked pots wouldn't sell. And I love it because it basically says you as a buyer have an obligation. So what does that mean? It means, for instance, that one example of two examples, if you don't mind, is being humane. So, for instance, as you may know, the tuna industry discovered that dolphins, like flipper, circle and eat tuna. But if you're a fisherman, if you set your net over this area where you see the dolphins playing, you capture more tuna, but you also drown the dolphins. So a lot of people, including me, didn't think that was reasonable because dolphins are just incredibly smart, actually sometimes kind, not always, but kind animals.
Yeah, they show compassion even for other species, which is rare in the animal kingdom.
Yes. So they required, through Congress, that there be a little circle on the tuna can, depending on whether or not the fishermen had used that technique to catch the dolphins. Sorry, the tuna.
Tuna, yeah.
And it says dolphin safe. Well, people kind of got that. And for a while, people were careful about what tuna they bought. But then the tuna industry went back to Congress and said, tell you what, let's have two standards of safety. So there's another type of dolphin safe, whereas the original one has colorful. This one is black and white, and it says the same thing, tuna safe. I keep saying that, dolphin safe.
Dolphin safe, yeah.
But nobody knows the difference between the black and white, or the color, except you and me now, since we've talked about it. And I claim consumers need to know what they're buying, and it's their obligation, in part, to make sure what they're doing is humane.
Yeah, and so which one is so the real dolphin safe one is the colorful one, and the other one, the black one, is not as dolphin safe.
That's the one the lobbyists got to.
Yeah, that's horrible. And you know what's interesting about that, Rob? You bring that up is, to me, a lot of times people who are not business people will sometimes ask me, isn't it tough when you get these scathing reviews or people having issues with your company? And the truth of the matter is, for me, they're the most useful thing as a business person. And the reason why is because I'm very much on board with where you're at with this, where I essentially go, if they're having a problem, someone else is probably having this problem. And usually more people are, because not everyone speaks up. And so in a sense, I know they're mad, and sometimes it's, but I don't get defensive. I oftentimes say thank you, at least in my head, because they're solving some of these issues that we may not have seen as troublesome or issues until these people bring them to our attention. And I do, and I think maybe this is speaking to what I was talking about. I do think that we as individuals have incredible power and influence over other individuals, who then have incredible power and influence over organizations and over, the final sort of say in things. And so I do think showing up as a next level human, doing the work, as you said, which is hard, for ethics, makes a difference. We influence people. In a sense, our behavior is contagious.
Yes. And as consumers, we have some influence. The other key ethical problem I see right now is approximately 9 million lobsters a year are boiled alive because people say, I love lobster. 40 years ago, nobody cared about lobster. They were known as trash fish. But fine, they've become fashionable, so people now want their lobster. The trouble is, boiling alive a lobster takes on average 4 to 5 minutes for it to die. And the University of Bristol and some other academics have found that crustaceans like lobsters feel heat more intensely than humans do. So we are effectively creating a lot of pain in this animal just to have it for dinner. I should comment, by the way, we used to boil humans. 300 years ago in London, we boiled a pair of thieves in Hyde Park because that was the punishment for thievery.
Yeah.
But and I'm told in the Mideast, I've read that in the Mideast, still people are doing that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's still areas that are, my understanding is just a few, within the last decade, there was a stoning that happened in one of the places in the Middle East. And I love that you're bringing this up, because to me, these are the things that are incredibly important. It reminds me too of what goes on in the cattle industry, right? Where because of, people, stepping up and saying, look, these animals, have feelings. And when they're hearing another animal being slaughtered, and now they're these humane slaughterhouses, and we should do what we can do when it's when we're able to do it. Yeah. You know what I mean?
And we can often do quite a bit. So, for instance, a year or two ago, I was up in Maine, and I happened to be the one who was footing the bill for the dinner. And all these people said, I want lobster, I want lobster, I want lobster. And I said, great. I'm not paying for it unless we get the restaurant to agree to kill the lobster in a humane way. And they actually agreed. So the lobster showed up, and there was a knife wound in all their heads. indicating they were dead before they were tossed into the water. And it was a win-win. The lobsters weren't tortured. I felt good. Their lobsters were just as good as they'd hoped. So
yeah, and the big win, actually, Rob, if I can interject, the biggest win for me in that case is that you doing something that may be awkward, right?
was.
And so, but you doing that was an educational moment where you essentially probably educated people on the fact that this is what happens. And to me, there's that saying that, the way you do one thing is the way you oftentimes do everything. I don't think that's not my favorite cliche, but I do think it holds some allure here when we talk about ethics that, like, honestly, when you start thinking about ethics, then you start thinking like even the small things, because from my perspective, you said, and I love this, that ethics is work. And to me, whenever there's something that's hard, you start by practicing in the easy ways so that you can then be better in the more difficult times. And so to me, I've certainly, and I fail, most of the time. We're human, so I get it. Yeah. But I'm practicing, and I do think these small wins, I'm trying to be ethical in everything I do. As simple as, not breaking in line. Like, you see, people might think that's kind. I also think it's ethical and moral, where I essentially go, oh, did I break in line in front of you? Or, even driving in traffic and letting people merge. There's just little things that I see as moral, ethical, kind, compassionate things that I can do as a human that make me, more likely to be more next level human than base level human.
And you can recognize when the other person's ethical. Returning just as a final comment, Professor Moore came up with an interesting, he said, well, I've written this long book in Latin, but here's 2 quick rules of thumb, whether you can tell someone is ethical or not. 1, do they show gratitude? People who show gratitude are usually ethical people because they realize something's happening on the other side of the table. They usually recognize that there's, some give to both sides. So that's one. And the second one may surprise you. He said a sense of humor is a good sign that somebody has a sense of ethics, because it means that they're lifting themselves above, their short-term desires.
Yeah, I love humor because humor is one of these. I oftentimes think that the people we love the most, they tend to do 2 things. They tend to self-deprecate, not so much to take their power away, but they self-deprecate a little bit and they compliment. And humor has a way of, bringing yourself down just enough where people aren't threatened by you, and also being very inclusive where other people's status is up a little bit. And I love, people who have that type of humor. I also think the gratitude part is really interesting because gratitude to me means you must be empathetic because you obviously feel that there's some kind of exchange going on here, and that reciprocity is important to you in a sense. And to me, I feel like empathy and reciprocity, if we didn't have those 2 things as humans, I don't know that you and I would even be talking right now. So I love those 2 rules of thumb. And I think that's maybe a great place for us to end this. But before I do, I just want to ask you, is there any other things that you think we should know that you feel like, well, Jade, we kind of missed this one thing? Is there any final thoughts you have?
I would say nothing I haven't said before, that to be ethical doesn't happen by itself. You have to put a little bit of effort into it.
Yeah, 100%. And for all of you listening, it's funny, I was talking to Rob before we got on, and my assistant, I think, got the book. I have not read the book yet, but the book is Ethics and Hidden Greed, Your Defense Against Unethical Strategies and Violations of Trust. And it's brand new, May 2023. And we should mention you have a co-author on this, right? Hans, I don't know how to say the last name.
Yes, it's a Dutch name, Hans Gieskes.
Yeah.
And
Hans Gieskes.
He's on it partially for credibility. He was chairman and CEO of a company called Houghton Mifflin, another company called Monster.com, another company called LexisNexis, and 3 or 4 other companies. So there's a chapter in there which he largely wrote about ethics in the boardroom. And he talks about the outrageous stuff that filters up to the board. And unless the board has the gumption to say, no, it will happen.
Yeah. And this book really, I can't wait to read it. I was telling Rob, I do most of my stuff on Audible, so hopefully he's going to get out on Audible soon, but I'm going to make a exception on this particular book. But to have a guide, a modern guide for ethics, instead of having to go back and read Kant and, all the old philosophers, is really an amazing gift to the world, my friend. I so appreciate you. Is there a place where people want to contact you and are you on social media, any of these places? Where can people reach out to you?
Social media, so it's Rob Doctors. And institutionally, I'm on a website called Ethics and Hidden Greed.
So ethicsandhiddengreed.com. Rob Docters is and that's DOCDERS, right? Yeah, Doctors on social. And Rob, just hang on real quick because I want to make sure we got this recording, but I'm going to go ahead and stop it here. We appreciate everyone hanging out. Rob, thank you so much for your expertise, my friend.
Thank you.
You have been listening to the Next Level Human podcast with Dr. Jade Teta. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure you subscribe and consider leaving a review. You make the biggest difference when you pass on your lessons and inspire others. That's why reviews like this are so powerful. Your words may be the only ones that resonate for someone else. Please remember the information in this podcast is for educational purposes only. Always consult your personal physician or therapist before making any lifestyle changes. And finally, thank you for who you are in the world and the difference you make.